final method that we're going to look at now is the double declining balance amortization method. So this method multiplies straight line depreciation, so that rate, by 2. So remember that we calculated the straight line rate as 1 divided by the estimated useful life in years. So since this is double declining, we're going to multiply that by 2. And by doing this, we're accelerating amortization. So the expense that we record will be more in the earlier years. And every single year it goes down a bit. When you do this, you calculate or use this in 2 steps. So first, you compute the straight line, and this would really say straight line rate. So it's 1 divided by the estimated useful life in years. So I know that's small, sorry, there's not a lot of room here, but 1 divided by estimated useful life. And I did calculate that when we looked at straight line. So for our example, the estimated useful life is 5 years. So 1 divided by 5 is 20% per year. So that's the straight line rate. But we're using double declining. So we now take that 20%, our straight line rate, and we multiply it by 2. So the rate that we will use is actually 40%. So we're doubling up. So now we have our rate, and we will use this every single year. But we multiply this now against the asset's book value. So the cost minus accumulated amortization, that gets us book value. So whatever you're sitting at as your book value from the previous year, you multiply that by the double declining balance rate, and that will get you your amortization expense for the year. So we can see that at the bottom. Book value times that double declining rate. Okay, so we'll go through and walk through the calculations for our example. So we'll start it out with the T accounts as we've already done in previous examples. So we purchased the truck for $65,000. And now we track our accumulated amortization for the truck, as well as our book value. So truck and accumulated amortization are actual accounts. The book value is just a calculation that we're doing. So January 1st, 2020, when we purchased the truck, nothing has been recorded for amortization. So our book value at that point, when we first purchase it, is $65,000. Now, as it says on this previous slide, when we get to the end of the first year, so December 31st, 2020, we need to calculate amortization, and we take that book value and multiply it by our double declining rate, which is 40%. So I'm just going to do my calculations on the right here. So we times this by 40%, or 0.4, and we get $26,000. So for year 1, that is the amortization that we will record. So at December 31st, 2020, we debit amortization expense for $26,000 and credit accumulated amortization for the truck. And therefore, we can now post it to this T account. To calculate that our updated balance here at the end of year 1, our accumulated amortization is $26,000. So our book value is the cost minus this accumulated. So at the end of year 1, our book value is $39,000. Okay, so that's year 1. Now another year goes by, and we get to December 31st, 2021, and we need to record another journal entry. So we're going to use this book value from the previous year, our $39,000, times that by 40% or 0.4, and that gets us to 15,600. 39,000 times 40% is 15,600. So that is now the amortization expense we book for 2021 or year 2. Book 15,600. And therefore at the end of year 2, our accumulated total is 41,600. Again, we can update our book value, so 65,000 cost minus this new accumulated amortization. We have a book value of 23,400. So we just continue this on each year. So if you want to pause it and try the next couple years on your own, go until you get to the value at year 4. And I'll just continue doing that now. So 9,360 is what we would book December 31st, 2022. Gets us to the next balance of 50,960. So that's at the end of year 3. And our book value, 65,000 minus this 50,960 gives us a book value of 14,040. Again, we're using that book value times our 40% rate is 5616. So that would be booked in December 2023. And our updated accumulated balance is 56,576. So this is the end of year 4. And our book value at that point is now 8,424. So this is where now we need to really be paying attention. Because I know just doing the math for these years isn't that hard. But under double declining balance, we're using our straight line rate and we're basing our amortization on this useful life in years. So we think the truck is going to last 5 years. We're just upping the amortization so it's more at the start. But since we're basing this on years, when we get to the 5th year, we want our book value to equal the residual value. That's always where we stop amortizing, as we've seen in those previous videos. So for units of production, it just happened to work out that the end of year 5 was when we got there. That's not always the case for units of production because we're basing it on, it was kilometers in this case. Whereas straight line and double declining, these are based on the number of years. So when we get to the end of that final year of the estimated useful life, which in this example is 5 years, we want our book value to equal that residual value. So rather than taking 8,424 and timesing it by 40%, and if you do that, you'll never get to 0. You would always continue. So at the end of year 4, when we're now going to be recording this at December 2024, which is year 5, we now say 8,424, but we're going to subtract 5,000 because we want to get to that $5,000 residual value that we know from the question. So we're trying to get to this at the end of 5 years. So we need to book 3,424 as our amortization in this final year. So that would be the journal entry we did in year 5. If we do this, we add it up and we get to a total accumulated amortization of $60,000, which leaves us at that book value equal to our residual value. So we know we stop now and we've reached our goal because book value at the end of the useful life, so this is at year 5, is equal to our residual value. So be careful for that when you're doing double declining, that you just don't keep going and timesing by 40%. Excuse me, sorry about that. You don't always times by the 40%. You do until you get to that final estimated useful life year. Okay, so those are the 3 methods. As I've shown before, the T account is one way, or you can use kind of this chart format for calculating. So here we're taking this rate. They've got the book value in 2 different places so that you can times that by the previous year's book value. So you can see they're using the previous year's amount. That gets you to your amortization expense. As always, the opening accumulated plus the expense for the year gets you to your ending. So you do that each year. And then book value is always the cost. So this column minus your accumulated amortization. And in the same way we did in our T accounts, you figure out that final year's amortization expense as the book value minus your goal of getting to the residual value. Okay, so now that we've gone through and we've done all 3 methods, we can compare these to each other and really see with numbers how these compare. So straight line amortization, we know that you're recording the exact same amount every year for the useful life. So every year we recorded the $12,000, and that got us our full depreciation or amortization equal to the amortizable cost. So I want to note, this is depreciation or amortization expense that was booked each year. So we got to $60,000, which makes sense because the amortizable cost was $60,000. That's the cost minus the residual value. So straight line is even each year, and therefore, as it says at the bottom, it's used for assets that either generate revenue or the benefit of that asset is used up pretty evenly over time. So it's unlikely that it'll be exactly benefited the same amount for those 5 years, but if it's pretty close, straight line makes the most sense to record and match that expense evenly over those years and evenly as revenue is generated. Units of production, we can see here, there's no necessarily rhyme or reason for time-wise when it's highest or lowest. Our highest year was year 2, then it went down, continued to go down, but it was all based on the amount that we used that. So the kilometers that we drove the truck. Therefore, units of production is best for assets that only wear out because of physical use. So if you have some sort of asset that has idle time and it's not being used for different times, you would wait. You wouldn't be getting the benefit when it's idle. So if it's only wearing out because of physical use, units of production is best, and you just record the amortization expense as it's used. Now for this example, as I mentioned earlier, it just happened to be that we got to this $60,000 after 5 years. But that's how the question was written. That's not necessarily the case. Because if you're using units of production, you're just looking at the number of units, or so in our case, the number of kilometers. Therefore, if we had done this and the kilometers driven were different than we were given here, we might have actually ended amortization maybe in year 3 if we drove it more to start. Or if we didn't drive it as much, it's possible we could have continued using this for multiple years. So we could have had amortization go longer. So units of production does not take time into consideration. Straight line, as we see, and declining or double declining balance, they're always based on the number of years. So these ones we would always see end at the end of the useful life, which was 5 years in this case, but it's not always 5 years. It's based on the question. So double declining, as we can see here, the expense is the highest in the first year, and then it continues to drop after that. So we use double declining, for assets that produce more revenue or provide more benefit in the early years and then have less benefit after that. So we're matching the expense to either the revenue or the benefit used. So if that's more in the first few years, then we want this expense to be higher. And then it just drops as time goes on. So it's important to know how you do these and then when you would choose to use each of these methods. Okay, so that's how we record and calculate amortization. In the next videos, we'll look at how we record the sale or disposal of PP&E at the end of its useful life or when we're done using it.